Up until now, we have explored the civil rights movement in Boston by analyzing influential people's roles and important events. Now, we will step back and draw some general conclusions about the Boston civil rights movement by offering framework to explain the larger trends. While racism contributed to the tension in the movement, more significantly, whites in Boston demonstrated it against integration due to the issues of class resentment, pride in ethnicity, and competitive politics.
The Black civil rights movement in Boston elicited resistance from whites, mainly poor whites from southern Boston, due to tension between working-class whites and Black activists. Whites engaged in reactionary populism, a resistance to maintain constitutional rights because whites felt undermined by Black motives. Whites protested desegregation to maintain their quality of education, conserve power, and ultimately keep Blacks from receiving a fair education. Many rich whites left Boston to live in the suburbs or sent their children to private schools. This white exodus further angered the poor whites because they could not afford to escape desegregation. The Irish especially resisted desegregation to protect their class status. As the lowest social class of whites, the Irish believed that Blacks should not raise up to white social levels, as they did not want to share the bottom of the pyramid with Blacks. It was not so much about racism as it was the resentment of Blacks who challenged the Irish place in society. The Irish also had a strong sense of ethnic pride. They lived in predominantly Irish neighborhoods and were extremely defensive over city and political territory. In Boston, the Irish were historically discriminated against. To overcome this oppression, the Irish took over the majority of power in politics. They feared losing power and felt resentment and anxiety towards Blacks for the usage of the political system in Black favor. The Irish believed Blacks abused the power of democracy by undermining the Irish majority and representation. The federal government forced desegregation upon inner-city whites. Judges who enforced desegregation were predominantly wealthy and did not suffer the consequences of segregation themselves. This angered inner-city whites who were forced to give up their own rights to Blacks. Due to the federal court orders, some white children had to go to schools in Black neighborhoods rather than their own neighborhood schools. The Irish and other poor whites resented how the color blindness of MLK's dream changed to what they saw as race consciousness in the 1970s, in which children were solely assigned to schools based on race. However, race had always been an issue because of segregation's existence. Boston whites rejected racial injustice in principle, but were unwilling to eliminate injustice as they had to sacrifice their own rights for minorities.
The white backlash in Boston and Little Rock had similar goals: to resist desegregation, but contrast in the reasons behind their motivations. In Little Rock, Governor Orville Faubus manufactured the tension between poor whites in Arkansas against Blacks, and roused segregationist demonstration. On the contrary, in Boston, Louise Day Hicks did not create the tension. She merely exploited the overwhelming Boston white resistance against desegregation which already existed. The Boston anti-busing movement was not a matter of politicians creating tension, but whites expressing their resentment. Although Americans pride themselves on their democratic foundation and ideals, this same democracy contributed to the presence of segregation in Boston. Small minorities that had oppressed constitutional rights portrayed the paradox that more democracy led to less freedom and equality. Elected political figures used segregation to become more popular. School officials were less willing to promote desegregation because the officials that voted to desegregate tended not to get reelected. Hicks supported segregation and claimed that every time the Negroes demonstrated, the whites campaigned for her. Democracy in elections tended to lead to segregation because the whites held the popular vote and the majority of power. In response to the tension of the civil rights movement, the Kiernan Report was created, which found that Massachusetts has 55 racially imbalanced schools, 45 of which were in Boston. The report brought forward the racial imbalance and segregation in Boston schools and stated that racial imbalance was educationally harmful to both Black and white children. The NAACP attempted to stop segregation in schools and improve inferior facilities by discussing the issue with the school board. The NAACP wanted to train white teachers to remove prejudices against Black children and to end discrimination in hiring teachers. In response, Louise Day Hicks claimed that integration would harm both Black and white students. The school board denied that any segregation was present in Boston schools, but intentionally kept schools segregated. The selfish views of the democratically elected school board allowed segregation to continue.
The Boston Civil Rights Movement portrayed the ultimate struggle between Americans for their natural right to freedom. The movement was more than just tension between black and white, but broadens the scope to question the core of American values themselves, and whether or not we Americans can ever truly reach equality.